welcome Professor Shanto Iyengar here in Florence at the European University Institute. For those who don't know, Professor Iyengar is the William Robertson Co-Professor of American Studies at Stanford University. He is the director of the Communication Lab at Stanford, and also currently the co-principal investigator of the American National Election Study. Welcome in Florence, Professor Iyengar. I am Dietlind Stolle, James McGill Professor at McGill University, and I'm asking you a few questions today. Thank you for taking the time to participate in this interview. Well, let's pose the context here for us. The context is that tonight we will be watching the first presidential debate between candidate Trump and President Biden. And the expectation is, of course, that it will be highly contentious. So kind of relating to your research on political polarization, what is your take on the current situation in the United States with regard to political polarization in general?
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. Yes, the debate is scheduled for tonight. Now, being in Europe, we'll have to stay up very late to watch it. But I agree with you. I think it is going to be very contentious, and that reflects the nature of recent American politics. As you suggested, the country is highly polarized. This has happened over the last 50 or 60 years, and it has reached the point where the two political parties see each other as existential threats, basically. So that Democrats and Republicans are unwilling to even consider voting for an opposing candidate. Mm-hmm. So my sense is that the debate, given the polarized state of American politics, it's not going to change anyone's opinion. Certainly among partisans, they are so entrenched that, Biden could essentially do anything and he would still be supported, and the same goes for Trump. So the only people who might be swayed by this debate are we've got about 15 to 17% of the electorate that has no attachment. They're just so-called independent voters, and they would certainly have an open mind, and if something happens that is one-sided, if one of the candidates makes a dramatic blunder of some sort, that might make a difference. So in that sense, the polarization of American politics has meant that elections have become less volatile, because the two parties can take, 95% of their base will show up and vote for them. And that means that it's only the sort of that small margin of the swing vote that's going to make the difference. Mm-hmm.
Has affective polarization increased over the last few years when Biden was in office?
I don't think it has increased that recently. I think the major increase has happened post-Obama. So if you look at the American National Election Studies data, we have the same question that's been repeatedly asked. One of those questions is this so-called feeling thermometer, where we ask them, how do you feel about people who vote for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party? And the lowest score on that thermometer you can get is 0. And between 2008 and 2020, the percentage of people who said 0 when asked about the opposing party has gone up like by 300%.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Okay, that shows us something. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, some people argue on the academic side that affective polarization also means the end of U.S. democracy. That affective polarization is really a threat to democracy, whereas others see it more as a temporary radicalization of one camp over another. What is your view on that?
Well, I guess I would say I'm somewhere in between those two perspectives that you just laid out. On the one hand, I do believe that the degree of polarization has led to some compromising of essential democratic practices. The best example I can think of in that regard would be the concept of accountability. So in the old days, before the polarization took off, when candidates did not perform, so for example, when unemployment went up under some president's watch, they would be penalized. People would withdraw support. And similarly, you would think like when millions of people are dying and someone is president, you would think that that would lead to a reduction in popularity. But during Trump's first term and COVID hit, it had no impact. So that's what I mean by the erosion of accountability, is that people are no longer willing to sanction or punish candidates from their own party, even when they engage in obvious crimes. In the most recent case, Donald Trump has been convicted of a felony crime, which is it's not a trivial speeding incident. And yet, it seems that his level of public support has increased in the aftermath of his conviction. So in that sense, I think that's unfortunate. That means that American voters have become pretty much like robots. They're not willing to look at the pros and cons of the different candidates. They're simply automatically voting for their person no matter what. Trump famously remarked, I could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and it wouldn't affect my support.
Is that what you see?
I regret to say he was entirely accurate.
And is this a phenomenon that is mostly happening on the right, or is it happening on both political sides?
No, I would say it's quite symmetric. If you look at the data, if you look at the number of people who really hate the opposition, there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats. If anything, I would say the virulent opposition to Trump exceeds Republicans' distaste. I mean, the Republican side basically sees Joe Biden as, an old man who is incapable. They don't necessarily see him as a malicious person or an immoral person, whereas the Democrats, I think, they include those kinds of descriptions when they talk about Trump.
Mm-hmm. So you were talking about one important mechanism of democracy, accountability, that is being threatened. But at the same time, it is also true potentially that if your favorite candidate is undemocratic, that will also be accepted. So even beyond the mechanism. So is that a true danger that we see in today's America?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. When I said that, I was using accountability as just one example.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The level of polarization has now reached the point where people are unwilling to accept the outcome of elections when the election doesn't suit their preference. So January 6th is a classic example. Trump basically organized an insurrection, led to a major uprising, a violent uprising, and that's obviously a threat to democratic norms and procedures. So yes, in that sense, backsliding has occurred, but I don't go so far as to see it as influencing willingness to engage in extreme behavior, for instance. There's been a lot of commentary in the United States recently about how partisans are willing to use violence to achieve their political ends. Those data are really weak. There are a lot of people who answer survey questions without taking them seriously. Other people have attempted to measure that more seriously, and when you use specific acts of violence, are you willing to drive your car into a group of protesters? Then you see that the level of support for violence drops to near zero. So in that sense, I don't think we are on the verge of civil war or civil strife. But I do think basic democratic norms and practices are being threatened.
And affective polarization is behind that
Absolutely,
threat.
absolutely.
Let's shift a little bit to Europe, since we are in Europe right now, and we are just after the European elections that have shown some interesting results of parties on the radical right kind of gaining a momentum in some countries in Europe. Do you see that the affective polarization that you observe in the United States is spilling over into Europe? Is there some sort of momentum here that we see that parties are influencing each other and that affective polarization is behind also some political phenomena we see here in Europe?
I'm not sure that there's a kind of a modeling that the Europeans are modeling themselves on the American case. What I think is happening is that you have a common divide. The immigration issue in the United States has really sparked this immense hostility, with Trump being very anti-immigration and the Democrats taking a more centrist position. And in Europe, I think you've seen immigration has become a really paramount issue in several nations. And it is that has led to the rise of populist movements and populist parties, and therefore you now have a very similar kind of intense argumentation over this issue, which increases people's sort of the stake, the emotional stake that they have in politics. And perhaps that is why polarization, there's a lot of data, as you know, suggesting that Europeans are also affectively polarized. And what used to be a almost exclusively American literature has now become a global literature, which is, I think, a very healthy development. But as you know, we have to then sort of recognize that there are fundamental differences between the European political framework, multi-party systems, obviously, coalition politics, whereas in the United States, it's black and white. You've got a two-party system, there's your side and there's the opposition, and there's nothing in between. In Europe, when we talk about affective polarization, we have to then make allowances for the fact that people don't necessarily relate to individual parties, but rather to blocks maybe, or to camps, or so it's a bit more complicated.
Mm-hmm. And does that mean that affective polarization cannot take hold as much in European society? That it's more difficult when there is not a one camp versus other, a left and right side, or two parties that are standing opposing each other, and when you have more coalitions and other parties standing in as well?
Yes, I think it makes it a bit more nuanced, so people don't have it's not a zero-sum black and white model, because sometimes a particular party may be on your side and other times it may not. So in a sense, I think that's one of the reasons that the US level of, so the intensity of disliking for the opposing party is like excessive, higher than you would anticipate in most multi-party systems, which is not to say that there isn't polarization, but I think it's more modest.
Mm-hmm. So polarization might take a different character and might also have different consequences in the multi-party context.
Right. And it might over time, it might shift depending on the composition of the governing coalition.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Professor Iyengar, you have initialized a really hot research agenda with affective polarization. Lots of researchers are picking up this topic. Lots of articles, lots of books are being published on that account. We are here at a conference that speaks about it. When you look back and now we look at what we know from the research over the last years, what do you think is the key question in affective polarization research right now? And how should we approach that question? Is there a particular method or design that you think would be most successful?
Well, that's a complicated question, but yes, there's been 15 years of research on this phenomenon. Most of the research has focused on documenting the extent to which people dislike their opponents. And now in the last 2 or 3 years in the United States, and this conference in particular now, the agenda of this conference is, of course, how do we fix the problem? How do we treat affective polarization? My view is that documenting the phenomenon is obviously important, because if not, we wouldn't have anything to talk about. But I think the next step logically is to get at the causal dynamics. What explains this phenomenon? Over the last 50 years, something has happened to American society and American politics that has produced a change. And my view is that you have to look at the media environment as the fundamental cause. Because, I'm old enough, I was watching television news in the 1970s. Basically, we had 3 different television networks that commanded the entire country's attention, and everyone received the same news. Post-internet, that information environment is extinct. Now the consumer is king. The consumer can select from hundreds of different news sources. Many of these news sources do not produce reliable information. They're just propagating conspiracy theories. And so people are now being exposed to very low quality information. It's a fundamental problem. I don't think a democracy can survive if citizens do not agree on fundamental facts. And in the United States, approximately 60% of Republicans believe that Donald Trump won the 2020 election, which is a blatant falsehood. So in that sense, we need to do something about correcting the flow of misinformation. I think that's a real important sort of a stumbling block that we need to get over. Another potential cause is the fact that we have politicians who have incentives to be very virulent and nasty in their rhetoric. Because in the age of social media, it's all virality is what counts. If you make a really nasty statement about someone, that is just everywhere. And then you get more money, you get more visibility. And so American politics, when you look at the rhetoric and the tone of our campaigns, it is extremely nasty. People never say anything good about themselves. They're focusing 90% of their campaign on attacking their opponent. So that is a major cause of polarization. Mm-hmm. So I think it's actually premature to talk about identifying appropriate treatments until we have a good set of evidence documenting the causal dynamics. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, if you want me to, I can say more about the treatment. Most of the treatments that have been proposed to me are really quite superficial. They are aimed at the symptoms. Trying to, one of the most common treatments is let's encourage cross-party interaction. Let's have Democrats and Republicans go to a bar and have a beer together. Well, that's fine, but that's not getting at the fundamental problem here, which is why do they dislike each other in the first place? And that has to do with, as I said earlier, these fundamental changes in the media system, in the information environment. So if you're going to treat the problem, you need to treat the causes and not the symptoms. Unfortunately, most of the work on treatments is focusing on the symptom.
Mm-hmm. It's also probably because that work is easier to do, right? It's a more short-term treatment.
Yes, exactly.
And you don't have to make fundamental changes, for example, to the regulation of the media environment, which would be a much more difficult undertaking. But you mentioned the keyword media, and I wanted to talk about your new edition of the book Media Politics, a Citizen Guide. And if you could just for our audience maybe give a glimpse of the key messages you focus on in terms of the role of news media and politics. You refer to it right now as a fundamental cause or potential fundamental cause for polarization. What other points would you want to mention from that book for our audience?
Well, I think the relationship between the media in the form of reporters and journalists and politicians has changed, and it's changed for the worse. In the 1980s and the 1970s, anything before the internet, candidates, if they wanted to get their message across to the public, they had to go through the media. They didn't have their own sources of communication. Today, because social media, anyone has a Twitter account, if you're on Facebook or any of those platforms, you can reach people directly without having to go through the press. And that, to me, has been one of the, as I said earlier, is one of the major causes of why we've got this kind of beliefs in conspiracy theories and the spread of misinformation. So unfortunately, we have lost this. Professional journalism is no longer the key intermediary between politicians and the public. Because of the growth of social media, politicians can now reach their base on their own. And so they can say any kinds of, there's lots of outlandish, Trump every day spreads, tons of lies, and nothing happens. There's there's no way that he can be sort of told, or that his audience can be told that, hey, you're being fed a bunch of falsehoods.
There's no moderator anymore.
That's right. There's no gatekeeper in a sense.
Gatekeeper, yeah.
So that's unfortunate, but I don't think there's much you can do about that. And the press, I have to say, the press has contributed to their own demise, because in recent years, because of the competition, the U.S. press is entirely based on the commercial model. We're the only country in the world that does not have a major public broadcaster. So everything is cash only. And so everyone's trying to attract more eyeballs. And so the press has started covering political campaigns as like a horse race. It's all about the polls, who's ahead, who's behind, trying to get people sort of enticed into watching. And so that creates very superficial coverage. You don't get stories about the platforms, the issue positions, the substance. And so, in a sense, because we have a market-based media system, soft news, news about sex, sleaze, and scandal, drives out news about serious public policy debates. And that, in many ways, has contributed to the erosion of fundamental norms. Americans, one of the things that in Europe, it's sort of a contrast. The Europeans know much more about current affairs than Americans, because the American media just basically ignore substantive policy issues. Foreign policy is probably the classic case. Americans just they know almost nothing about what's happening in Ukraine. Very superficial sense of what's happening in Gaza, even though these are just massive, massive events. So that's a different level of the problem, that the fact that the American public is not so sort of savvy about political developments.
Mm-hmm. In some European countries, we do have public broadcasting, and it is supported by some government funding and other public funding. But what we do see currently is also a turn away from the voters for the more extreme parties from these channels, because they feel that these channels are paying more attention to the established party rhetoric and so on. So even the public broadcasting has not been able to bring in these lost groups of the population. So maybe it is still not solving, though, all the problems that we see in society. We still see this kind of breaking away in our society, despite a more informing public broadcasting system.
I think that would be a very interesting research question to investigate. My view is that the countries that have really strong public broadcasters, which command more than 50% of the audience, so if you look at Japan, Norway, and Germany, I would hypothesize that the countries in which the public broadcaster has the largest market share are the countries that are least polarized. Simply because, the BBC, everyone's tuning in. They're just loyal. They know that what they're getting is fact-based information. So I would theorize that the strength of public broadcasting is in many ways a kind of a proxy for this kind of the extent to which people are exposed to an information commons. And so in that sense, I think if we can strengthen public broadcasting, that would be a very good thing.
Okay, that's a good hypothesis to test. In previous interviews, you mentioned that we see more and more polarization in non-political domains, and you give some examples of marriage and the importance of political preferences in dating apps and so on. Could you share with us any updates on this issue with regard to your research?
Well, one of the interesting, as you say, that's one of the fundamental sort of symptoms of affective polarization, is that it has spread, the divide has spread into entirely non-political domains. So as you said, people are now dating co-partisans. Marriage is now almost exclusively, about 80% of American households today, if you have two adults living together, they have the same party registration. The most recent example I can think of is children. So we've got data now on middle school children, people in the age group 9 through 12. And it turns out they are just as polarized as their parents. In fact, CNN, the American television network, is now doing a special report. They went out on their own and interviewed about 100 middle schoolers in 3 different American states. And what they found is really astonishing, because it's essentially like a mirror image of what their parents are saying. And so the Republican kids in this sample all think that Joe Biden has dementia. And the Democratic kids all think Donald Trump is not just a crook, but he's even worse. So the fact that you've got polarization in the middle school level, that I think is quite shocking.
Also shows maybe that households are being politicized at the same time.
Very much so, very much so. So yes, so marriage, the dating studies. We've just completed a study, in fact, where we find that people who are undergoing divorce, who are separating, are more likely to have political disagreement.
Wow.
So we don't want to necessarily say that it's causal, but it's certainly suggestive.
Mm-hmm. At the moment, we see that affective polarization in politics spills over into the private sphere. That's what you're observing.
Very much so, yes.
And is it inevitable that it happens?
Well, again, it depends a lot. The United States is a very big country, and so it depends on where you live. Now, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is 80% Democratic. So even if I wanted to go out and date a Republican, I'm limited to 20%. So in a sense, a lot of it is not deliberate. It's because of this phenomenon of what we call sorting, that people in particular areas are very homogeneous in their political views. So if you go to Texas, it's the other way around. It's all Republican. So very few opportunities for Democrats and Republicans to interact.
Professor Iyengar, thank you very much for this interview, and for the viewers, you can see the full keynote speech in the link below.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.